The following video is brought to you by YouTube. If Hitler was alive today, he would have a YouTube Red show. Ah, lore. It's a word you hear a lot nowadays. For those who may not be familiar, lore is a slang term that essentially refers to the history behind a person, location, or world. It's a common trend in storytelling as a form of world building. So many iconic stories create such vast worlds with tons of history. Think Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. The world those stories take place in existed long before the stories themselves. The universes feel authentic and lived in. We watch iconic characters start from nothing and grow into legends. Everything has lore. Even me. Remember my wacky animal sidekick, Pixel Clock? Oh hey buddy, long time no see, what you been up to? You what? They said that it was an electrical fire. Oh my god. Those poor orphans. So Sonic, right? Yes, even our favourite blue rat's got lore, and let me tell ya, it's pretty wild. Of course that's to be expected. After all, the series has been going for over 30 years. We went from saving animals and robots to gods of destruction, government conspiracies, friendship, fucking aliens! Knock knock, who's there? Sun God! Gods! Get your gods here! Genies! British people! Point is, it's a lot. And many fans, myself included, have spent years trying to figure out how all of these elements flow together into a consistent timeline. So much so that Sega themselves have been trying to do the same. How do you make heads and tails of a series that's known for being incredibly strange and experimental? And does it even matter? Does Sonic need lore? Well, that's what I'm here to discuss. Sonic had lore right from the beginning. The art direction of the classic game showcased a world rich in history and mythology. We had ancient civilizations, mystical artifacts, magical floating islands, and the industrialization of nature. Sure, none of this stuff is needed for the games to work, but it is appreciated. But then Sonic Adventure happened. Sonic's jump to 3D was incredibly ambitious, not only in terms of translating Sonic's gameplay to a new dimension, but also his world. This was the first Sonic game to give the characters voices and really show off their personalities. It even references events from the classics and expands on concepts they introduced, such as exploring the history of the Chaos Emeralds and the Echidnas. And while Sonic Adventure hasn't aged great, it still told a compelling story with the technology they had. But here's where things start to get weird. See, Sonic has always had a strange presence both in Japan and the West. The reason for this is because Sonic is a fundamentally Japanese character that also happens to be inspired by Western culture. So when Sonic came to the West, Sega of America marketed him very differently from Japan. In Japan, Sonic was designed to represent the wind. He was a force of nature, a dreamlike character that would swoop in and help people with their problems. Whereas the West heavily leaned into his attitude and the trends of the 90s. He was like Bart Simpson on speed.
I don't have a car, it's me, Bart!
And to Sega of America's credit, it worked. Sonic became an icon and found success when he didn't in Japan. This led to him starring in comics, cartoons, even parades. So what does this have to do with lore? Well, Sonic Adventure had an infamously bad English localization. This led to the voice cast having a lack of direction and lines of dialogue being altered to appeal more to a Western audience.
Wake up!
I was on a snooze cruise, I guess.
And don't get me wrong, I love these lines. They're iconic and hilarious. But they also show the disconnect between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, a disconnect that existed from the very beginning of the series. And while Sonic Adventure came out relatively unscathed, this rocky relationship between East and West would have many ups and downs. But we'll come back to that later. So when did things get messy? It's hard to say. You could argue the lore fell apart after the jump to 3D, with Sonic's bizarre abstract world grounding itself more in reality. Maybe it was the modern redesigns that came with entering a new generation of gaming. Maybe it was the ever-expanding cast of characters. Personally, I'd argue Sonic's lore remained relatively consistent for most of the 2000s. Sure, there's a couple of plot holes here and there, but nothing too crazy. But then you have Silver and Blaze. Look, I love Silver and Blaze, but everything surrounding their introduction to the series is a mess. First we got Silver, introduced in Sonic 06 as the third protagonist before the game hits the reset button and the events of the game's story were erased, meaning that Silver's introduction was also erased. He was reintroduced in Sonic Rivals, which no one played, and it's kind of hard to tell if the game is even canon. Blaze debuted in Sonic Rush as a princess of an alternate dimension, then a year later she debuted again in Sonic 06 where she's from the future. Then another year later she's back to being a princess again. Not only that, but both Blaze and Silver share an antagonist in Eggman Nega. Except in Sonic Rush he's from the Soul Dimension, and in Rivals he's from the future, so which one is it? If Rush is canon, then why is he in Rivals? And if Rivals isn't canon, then Silver just doesn't have an introduction. After the fallout of Sonic 06, the series quickly got back on track with Unleashed and the Storybook games. Whether you love these games or hate them, they were still pretty consistent with the lore the series had built up. Sonic Unleashed is a game all about travelling the world. This is arguably the most world building we've ever gotten out of the series. And while Secret Rings and Black Knight take place in alternate worlds, they still feel consistent with what came before. And now for the obligatory segment on the 2010s! Yeah, we all know the drill. Dumbed down stories, childish humour, inconsistent characterization, disregarding the series' history. I've gone over this a bunch of times. This is where the divide between Sega of America and Sega of Japan gets particularly awkward. Now, Sonic is no stranger to localization issues and things that get lost in translation. The reason for this is because the story and dialogue would be written in Japanese first and then translated to English. And as we got to the later half of the 2000s, the English and Japanese scripts were nearly identical, meaning we were constantly getting an authentic portrayal of these characters and their stories. But with the start of the 2010s, there was a shift. Sonic Colors was the first Sonic game to have the dialogue written in English first and then translated into Japanese. All these lame jokes, they're from the English script. Thankfully, the core of Colors' story is strong enough to get out relatively unscathed, since the outline for the story was provided by the Japanese side. Even with all the unfunny jokes, the ending never fails to make me smile. Generations was more of the same. There's not much of a story to talk about, and while some of the writing still feels off, I think the story works fine as a charming, laid-back celebration of Sonic's history. Until they ruined it.
We're traveling through time, Sonic!
Without the time stones?
I know what that is!
But now we arrive at the worst Sonic story ever written. Lost World. Ah, Lost World. You really ruined everything, didn't you? Boring story, terrible characterization. Zavok. This was the first Sonic game where the story and the dialogue were written in English first and then translated into Japanese. And boy does it show. Generations may have been generic, but it was charming. It didn't ruin the characters the way Lost World did. So safe to say, Sonic was in a weird place. In the West he'd been turned into a parody of himself, and in Japan he was exactly the same as he always was. And Sonic Forces didn't really help. Now, I don't hate the story of Forces. I'd actually rank it higher than some of the stories we've gotten recently because I genuinely believe it managed to capture the spirit of the series. Just in a very messy way. But it lacks its own identity and relies on things that worked in the past without understanding why they worked. The series needed something big. Something Forces promised but didn't deliver. It's easy to see why so many people hated it. So with the help of beloved Archie Sonic writer Ian Flynn, Sonic Team set out to make a game that would finally get things back on track. They made things worse. I don't like Frontiers, big shock, I know. But I didn't used to feel that way. I think we tend to forget just how desperate we all were for another Sonic game that took itself seriously. So when Frontiers came out, it was a breath of fresh air. But Frontiers is like a poison. The longer it sits with you, the worse it gets. The goal of Frontiers was to recontextualize the lore and canon of the series into something more cohesive. But there's just one problem. Frontiers is not a video game. It's a 10-hour apology. I have never played a game so insecure. Frontiers is on its hands and knees begging you to like it. It's a game so focused on fixing things from previous games that it forgets to have a point. We all complained about Sonic Team constantly jingling keys in our faces until they jingled the right keys. Classic nostalgia is out. Let's pander to the adventure fans. Remember Chaos? Remember Dark? Neo Metal Sonic? Dark Gaia? Eclipse Cannon? The Black Arms? Babylonians? Maria! Do any of these references add anything to the story? No? But Pixel, I thought you were complaining about the lack of continuity in the 2010s. Isn't this a good thing? Well, Mr. Strawman, there's a right and a wrong way to establish continuity in a long-running franchise. You can write a compelling story with faithfully written characters with small lore details that longtime fans can appreciate, or you can take the Frontiers approach and waterboard your audience with mindless fanservice all while lobotomizing your characters and disrespecting their history. And it's a shame because Frontiers almost did it right. The one reference I will always defend in Frontiers is the Ancients looking like Chaos, which was apparently pitched by Ian himself. It's an interesting piece of lore that adds an extra layer to Chaos in SA1 without taking away from that game's story or Frontiers' story. The problem with Frontiers is that its fanservice is inconsistent. Knuckles' whole arc is about him wanting to take a break from guarding the Master Emerald, but this is the first time we've seen him even mention the Master Emerald in a game for over a decade. And this wouldn't be a problem if Frontiers was its own standalone story, but they reference games where he wasn't guarding the Master Emerald and they don't offer an explanation. The fanservice is actively undermining the story. Tails' arc is a response to the criticism he faced in Sonic Forces, resulting in an arc that repeats his journey in Sonic Adventure. He spends the entire game effectively criticizing his own writing instead of just being Tails. You could have just written Tails properly and the audience would be able to infer that he got over what happened in Forces. And Amy, oh boy. Amy Rose is not in Sonic Frontiers. I have no idea who this is. Amy's arc, if you can even call it that, is about her sharing her love with the world, something she has literally always done. But now we have the bold choice of completely sucking out any charm or personality Amy had in favour of making her the girl. Boy, I'm so glad Amy was permanently changed to appeal to people who never liked it to begin with. That's awesome. There's also the fact that the original script was going to put an end to Sonic and Amy's relationship for the sole reason that Ian doesn't like it.
The whole goal with Amy's story in Frontiers was to bring it to some kind of end. Because this whole will they, won't they, cat and mouse that we're never going to actually get an answer on felt antagonistic. Not necessarily intentionally, but, you know, this constantly dangling carrot without any real commitment one way or the other. It's like, let's just have them move on in some way. Do the characters a service so that there's more to them than just the, will they have kisses one day?
Okay, so what am I getting at? Well, my point is that the Sonic lore is a mess, and the more you try and fix it, the more damage you do. Sega of America are constantly pandering to Sonic fans and what's popular instead of staying true to the original source material, just like in the 90s. There's a lack of creative vision in the series. Writers can tweak the characters and stories to suit their tastes instead of honouring what came before. And this obsession with lore and continuity is a crutch, another nostalgic element that can be milked dry to appease a fanbase that can't even agree on what it wants. The only Sonic game we've gotten recently that doesn't rely on the past is ironically Sonic Superstars. Now I know it's a classic Sonic game, so there's obviously a slightly nostalgic quality to it. But unlike Sonic Mania, it's completely original. Original stages, original characters, original ideas, and original story. Dare I say the best story we've gotten since Black Knight. That doesn't mean it's not flawed, because it absolutely is, but it is authentic. I never felt like I was being pandered to in Superstars. I never felt like I was playing a product. I was playing a Sonic game. This is no doubt thanks to the game being directed by Takashi Iizuka and the father of Sonic, Naoto Oshima, and you can feel that influence through the whole game. It's not perfect, but any game that has this in it is doing something right. It's like comparing the Star Wars prequels to the sequels. Both are incredibly flawed, but one is a shallow attempt at capturing the magic of the original while ruining beloved characters and relying on cheap fanservice, and the other has its own share of problems, but it's a consistent, uncompromised vision from some of the original creators. Shadow Generations was an improvement over Frontiers thanks to the amount of character supervisors involved with the writing. However, I still think it falls into a lot of similar traps. Shadow's character regressed back to how it was in SA2, effectively undoing a lot of his character arc. Shadow broke free from his past, only to be shackled to it again for seemingly no good reason. Maria's origins were also altered. Instead of being born on the Ark due to its sterile conditions, she was born on Earth and moved to the Ark when she was older because the low gravity keeps her condition in remission. Which is not how that works. Low gravity actually weakens the immune system, which would not be ideal for someone with an immune disease. It took me like 3 seconds to look that up. You literally had an explanation from SA2's original writer and you still changed it. I realise this may come across as nitpicking, and you wouldn't really be wrong. But the reason I focus on details like this is because of how much the series obsesses over lore and continuity, while also lazily picking and choosing which lore they want. Like, I'm sorry, but if you're gonna commit to it, you need to commit to all of it. You can't just change what you don't like. It's like when Sonic fans tried to rewrite 06 without Elise. Like, 06 is about Elise, you can't just get rid of her. The Sonic canon will always be a mess, and that's okay. Sonic is not a giant long-running story. It's a series of individual adventures that can exist at any point in time with any collection of characters. The series is about all of life's little adventures, the friends we meet along the way, the good times and the bad times. It's pure and it's timeless, and when you try and put all the pieces together, you misunderstand the appeal of the series. It's like the Zelda timeline. Sure, it's cool to try and piece it all together, but that's not what the series is about. The reason we see so much discourse about characterization online is because of how flippant Sega of America have been with the series and how it portrays its characters. We have fans working on the series who seemingly don't care or understand things established in the original source material. That's a huge problem. The fanbase screams Sonic is Sonic, but no one can accept that their favourite version of Sonic may not be accurate to what Sonic is. If you love Archie Sonic or Movie Sonic or Prime Sonic, that's okay. You can like whatever Sonic you want, but if you're going to have a discussion about the series, you need to factor in the source material. If I have a discussion about Dragon Ball, I'm not going to use the original English dub as an example, because it takes liberties that stray too far from the original manga and the author's intent. Goku isn't Superman and Sonic isn't Spider-Man. But when it comes to Sonic, it seems that you can't say anything without getting attacked. We have big names in the community that shut down criticism and send legions of their fans to harass others. Criticism is important and it's not done out of hate. We all love Sonic and want it to be as good as it can be. The idea that Sonic is ridiculous, because that implies that Sonic never had a consistent character or world. But as we've discussed, he did. Sonic is a very versatile character, but he's still a character. One with rules and guidelines that should be followed. If Sonic can be anything, then that means Sonic is nothing. Which just isn't true. The reason I'm mentioning this is because while Sonic lore may be a mess here in the West, it isn't in Japan. We should strive for Sonic to stay true to its roots, to have that same consistency instead of settling for pale imitations. Does Sonic need lore? Yes and no. Lore is certainly important in regards to characters and their history and keeping them as authentic as possible, but I don't think it needs to be obsessed over like it has been recently. A Sonic story should be able to stand on its own without relying on the past, because Sonic isn't about the past. It's about the present, the here and now. Sonic has no end, there is no grand plan, it's about the journey, not the destination.